Hello and welcome to the Commander's Quarters, your Magic the Gathering source that helps you command your budget. This show and episodes like this one are possible thanks to viewers like you. If you're looking for an easy way to help support this show, make sure that you like, share, and subscribe. Also, hit that bell notification icon so you don't miss any new episodes. You can also go check out our playmats and other merchandise at thecommandersquarters.com. Another easy way to support this show is with our TCG Player affiliate links. So whether you're buying a deck or individual cards, you can use this general link right here or one in the description. And the final way that you can support this show is by supporting us directly by becoming a patron. There are many benefits to being a patron, and I truly couldn't do this without all their support. Hey everyone, Mitch coming in from the Commander's Quarters studio. Welcome to the show. So on today's episode, I'm going to be talking about the newest deck in my collection, and this might be the craziest, jankiest one that I have ever built. And it's built around a pretty unassuming commander, and to be honest, at first I pretty much forgot that this commander existed. It's really not seen as that powerful of a commander, but when you build it in this off-the-wall direction, it can do some incredibly powerful and unexpected things. So this new commander that just got added to my collection is Nylea Keen-Eyed. And actually the reason that I'm showing this alternative version, the Constellation art, is because this one was actually cheaper, so I picked this one up. Regardless, Nylea Keen-Eyed is far from one of the most popular commanders out there, and it's actually even far from one of the most popular gods. Let's read about what this god does and talk about a typical direction for this deck. Nylea Keen-Eyed is a 5/6 god with Indestructible that costs 3 and a green. She has, as long as your devotion to green is less than 5, Nylea isn't a creature. Creature spells you cast cost 1 less to cast, and by paying 2 and a green, you reveal the top card of your library if it's a creature card you put in your hand, otherwise you may put in your graveyard. So even in my initial quick take, I talked about how this was a good value-based commander for a creature deck. She's hard to deal with because she's indestructible, and also she can even just not be a creature. She can save you mana on your creature spells, and she can also get you creatures off the top of your library. Now again, my quick take on this commander came out over a year ago at this point. And actually, to be honest, this commander didn't really stand out to me, and it was pretty forgettable. So I didn't even think about it probably even once until a couple of weeks ago. And then when I thought about it, it just clicked. You see, one of my favorite decks of all time is my Joyride Weatherlight Captain deck, but it's also the one deck that I won't really play anymore. It's an Artifact Storm deck that is a bit too powerful and can have some really long turns. Now, I love building these kinds of decks though, because to me, it's an efficient puzzle engine that you put together. That's just how my mind works sometimes. Anyways, unless I'm playing against incredibly high-powered decks and everyone else is okay with it, I'm not playing that deck anymore. So I was looking and trying to find a solution to build a similar type of deck that is nowhere near as annoying to play against, and it's a lot more fair. So now let me properly introduce you to the type of deck that no one is ever going to see coming: Mono Green Storm. That's right, Mono Green can do Storm. Nylea is the perfect commander for this deck. The most important text on this card is creature spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. So we're going to dump creature after creature onto the board as quickly as possible. Oh, and we won't have to actually pay for those creatures at all. Let me show you by jumping into how this deck works. This deck is essentially the island of misfit toys. A card like Mirror Moon Vessel might not have a lot of use elsewhere, but in this deck it is absolutely perfect. It is a simple 1/1 mirror for 1, and when it dies we add colorless. That's it. But an unassuming card like this does what we need and more. Because again, with Nylea in play, this is a free creature for us to cast, and when it dies, it gives us upside. Now this is a fantastic example of a creature that Nylea lets us cast for free. But don't worry, this little mirror is definitely not alone, because there are 30 more creatures in this deck that we can cast for free. Let's go through them quickly. Hope of Gearpore has flying and we can sack it for a benefit. Arcbound Worker has modular 1, and Sparring Contract puts a +1/+1 counter on target creature when it dies. And then there's Signal Pest, which has Battle Cry, and it can't be blocked except by creatures with flying or reach. Next up, there's Gingerbrute, which has haste, and we can pay to give it some evasion. And then Inquisitive Puppet scries 1 when it comes into play, and we can exile to make a 1/1 token. Then we've got Keeper of the Lens, which lets us look at face-down creatures we don't control. We can pay to regenerate Soul Navy Sentry, but an opponent gets a draw. And then we can also pay and tap Chronometon to make it bigger. I'm going to stop here really quickly though and mention that usually we're not going to be paying to activate things because we're going to be using our mana elsewhere. Next up, we've got some cards that really don't do anything special aside from just being 1/1s for 1 with Metallic Sliver, Mirror Servitor, and Universal Automaton, but again, that really doesn't matter that they don't do anything. So we've also got things like Whisper Gear Sneak, Jawbone Skulkin, and Mirror Mind Servant. With Jawbone Skulkin, we can pay 2 to give a red creature haste, but again, unless we're making a deal with an opponent, we're not going to be using that. And if we really want to, we can pay 2 and tap Mirror Mind Servant to shuffle our library, but again, most of the time, not so much. And then we've got Bonded Construct, which is a 2-1, but it can't attack alone, but we're going to be attacking with a lot more things, so usually it can attack. And then Clockwork Beetle starts off as a 2-2, but it loses a -1/-1 counter when it attacks or blocks. Next up, there's Brass Gnat, which doesn't untap during our untap step, but most of the time, that's not going to matter. And similarly, Brass Man doesn't untap either. We've also got some creatures with 0 power like Lightning Core Excavator and Mysterious Egg. Although they have 0 power, let's just say that there are ways to make that not so. So we're also going to be running Ornithopter's long-lost cousin, Roterothopter, a 0-2 with flying that costs 1. And then we've got a pair of Gargoyles with Locktwain Gargoyle and Thraben Gargoyle. Locktwain is a 0-3 and Thraben is a 2-2 with Defender. Now, although it has Defender, there are still plenty of things that we can do to make this card very useful. So similarly, we're also running Steel Wall, which is a 0-4 with Defender. Now, you might notice that this next Defender, Shifting Wall, doesn't cost 1, but it does cost X. So, thanks to Nylea, we can cast it for 1, and it comes into play with 1+1/1 counter on it. And then we've just got a straight-up 0 mana creature like Phyrexian Walker, which of course costs us nothing regardless. And now let's finish things up with our free creatures, going over Ornithopter, Endless One, and Ugin's Conjurant. Ornithopter is a well-known 0 mana creature, a 0-2 with flying. And then Endless One and Ugin's Conjurant again cost X, so Nylea can help us cast them for 1. So, again, 31 free creatures in this deck. But wait, there's technically more. So let's move on to my next category, talking about creatures that are technically free, and let's start off with one that actually isn't even technically free, so I'm sorry if this doesn't make any sense. But again, I was wearing a tinfoil hat in the thumbnail, so what do you expect? Anyways, Crashing Drawbridge is a fantastic card in this deck. It's a 0-4 wall with Defender that costs 2, and it has tap creatures you control gain haste until end of turn. So we will have to pay 1 mana for this. Oh darn. Being able to give all of our creatures haste in a mono green deck like this one is huge. This card truly can help us win the game out of absolutely nowhere. But earlier on in the game, it can make even more of our creatures essentially free to cast. So yeah, mana dorks that cost 1 like Llanowar Elves, Finehorn Elves, and Elvish Mystic essentially are free. They're all 1/1 Elf Druids that cost a green, and they tap for a green. So although Nylea is not reducing that cost, if we've got Crashing Drawbridge in play, we can just give them haste and allow them to tap to replace the mana that we used to spend on them. So similarly, we're also going to be running Boreal Druid, Arbor Elf, and Beastcaller Savant. Boreal Druid taps for colorless, Arbor Elf can tap to untap a forest, and Beastcaller Savant is just a little different. Now, although the other mana dorks don't get any benefit from Nylea's cost reduction, Beastcaller Savant does. Beastcaller Savant is a 1/1 for 1 and a green, and it has haste, tap, add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool, spend this mana only to cast a creature spell. So this mana dork already has haste and doesn't need help from something like Crashing Drawbridge. Because of Nylea, this just costs us a green, and we can just tap it for a green right away. Now we can only use that mana to cast creature spells, but again, the vast majority of this deck are creature spells. And then we've got some other creatures that can help us get us some lands into play with Elvish Pioneer, Frozen Wayfarer, and Sakura Tribe Elder. When Elvish Pioneer comes into play, we can put a basic land card from our hand into play tapped. By sacrificing Frozen Wayfarer, we get a land into play untapped. And then of course everyone knows Steve, we sacrifice Steve and we get a basic land from our library into play tapped. And again, Steve in this deck is even better, only costing us a green mana. And then we even have an MDFC dork that can help us out as well with Tangled Florahedron. If we need it as a land, great. If not, we can have it as a mana dork that just costs a green. So again, Nylea comes in huge not just for our 1 mana artifact creatures, but for our other creatures as well. Now, just putting down a bunch of tiny creatures really won't do much. And in fact, aside from a mana dork or two, you probably shouldn't play any of them until you're actually set up. So with this deck, you want to get set up with some incredible draw engines like Beast Whisperer, Primordial Sage, and Soul the Harvest. Whenever we cast a creature spell, both Beast Whisperer and Primordial Sage are going to draw us a card. And then Soul the Harvest says whenever another non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, you may draw a card. So again, in this deck, we have an absurd amount of creatures that we can cast for free. And now when we cast those creatures, or when they come into play, we're going to be drawing cards to replace them. This allows us to churn through our deck, putting creature after creature into play. Now, before moving on to the other card advantage engines that I'm going to be including in this deck, I just want to bring up one that I'm intentionally not including. Not because it's too expensive, but I just think that a card like this could lead to some even longer turns. Let's talk about the actual card first, and I'll talk about exactly why I left it out. Season of Growth is an enchantment that costs 1 and a green. It says whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, scry 1. And whenever you cast a spell that targets a creature you control, draw a card. Now that second part really doesn't matter because I don't think we've got any spells actually in this deck that actually target one of our creatures. But that first part, yes, can be very good in a deck like this. Every time one of our creatures comes into play, we scry. And this counts token creatures as well, and believe me, we've got ways to make a ton of tokens. Now again, the reason that I don't play Joy Root anymore is not just because of its power level, but also because it can take really long turns. Drawing cards is one thing, but choosing what card to ditch or keep on top is another. The more decision points that you have to make every single time something happens, the longer your turn's gonna take. So having, say, 2 draw engines in play is a lot different than having 1 draw engine and 1 scry engine. With the 2 draw engines, you're not really making a decision, you're just drawing 2. With a scry engine and a draw engine in play, you've got to make the decision whether to ditch a card or not off the top, and then choose when to draw. So that can take a lot longer, especially with token generating effects, which this deck has. Again, this is just personal preference though. The right call when it comes to making this deck more powerful is to include this card. But again, I'm trying to play a Storm deck that doesn't make people want to tear their hair out. And again, dumping creatures onto the board, then drawing some cards, then dumping more creatures on the board is a lot more palatable than dump creatures on the board, scry, draw, scry, dump more creatures, scry, draw. You see the picture. Again, make the choice for yourself though. Now back to the cards that are actually in this deck though, with Zendikar Resurgent, Hazoret's Monument, and Fecundity. Zendikar Resurgent is an expensive card at around $5, but with the low budget of this deck for a lot of the other cards, we can fit it in. It's going to double up our mana from our lands, and it also says whenever you cast a creature spell, draw a card. And then Hazoret's Monument says whenever you cast a creature spell, you may discard a card. If you do, draw a card. So this lets us ditch dead cards in our hand to draw cards. And then with Fecundity, we get even more value when our creatures die, because it says whenever a creature dies, that creature's controller may draw a card. Yes, this can benefit opponents, but they're not going to have anywhere near as many creatures in play as we do, so it's going to benefit us a lot more. And we even have some ways to get rid of our own creatures ourselves, like Skull Mulcher. It has Devour 1, so when it comes into play, we can sacrifice any number of creatures. When it enters the battlefield, we draw a card for each creature it devoured. So this can essentially draw us an absurd amount of cards in this deck. And again, if we've got Fecundity in play, we draw twice as many. And then of course, we can go on replacing those creatures with the ones we drew. Next up, we've got 2 spells that essentially do the exact same thing with Shamanic Revelation and Collective Unconscious. Each of them are going to draw us a card for each creature we control. On top of that, Shamanic Revelation does say you gain 4 life for each creature you control with power 4 or greater. Now, most of the time, this won't gain us any life, but there are some ways to get our creatures bigger, and we'll talk about that here in a bit. For now, let's talk about Creeping Renaissance, which can give us a ton of card advantage, but in a different way. It says choose a permanent type, return all cards of the chosen type from your graveyard to your hand. And on top of that, it's got flashback for 5 green. So if a lot of our creatures die or we sacrifice them, we're going to be getting them all right back. And then we cast them again, and fun times are had. Speaking of fun times, there's Abundance, which is an enchantment for 2 green. It says if you would draw a card, you may instead choose land or non-land and reveal cards to the top of your library until you reveal a card of the chosen kind. Put that card into your hand and put all their cards revealed this way in the bottom of your library in any order. So this essentially guarantees that we're not hitting any dead draws. Now, as good as all these cards are, there is still one that stands clearly above the rest in my opinion. And that would be the golden pick of this deck, which is the #1 card out of the 99, and the golden pick for this deck is Tangle Root. Tangle Root is a card that is essentially used in no decks. But for this deck's purposes, it is fantastic. It's an artifact for 3, and it says whenever a player casts a creature spell, that player adds green. This deck's goal is to cast a ton of creatures for free. And now every single time we cast one of those creatures, we're going to be gaining mana. So now that artifact creature that would usually cost us 1 mana, it's now essentially a ritual. There are 31 cards in this deck that net us mana now whenever this and our commander is in play. That is absolutely absurd. And this can lead to some really explosive turns. This allows us to turn those creatures into mana for our big draw spells to draw even more creatures to cast. This allows this already absurd deck to do even more absurd things, and yeah, there's a reason that it's the golden pick of this deck. But there are still some other engines that we still need to talk about. So let's talk about those creature token generating engines that I mentioned earlier with Genesis Chamber, Oketra's Monument, and Ayula's Influence. Genesis Chamber is an artifact that costs 2, and it says whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield, if Genesis Chamber is untapped, that creature's controller creates a 1/1 colorless mirror artifact creature token. Yes, this will benefit our opponents, but nowhere near as much as it's going to benefit us. Now, every single one of our non-token creatures that comes into play comes in with a friend. Speaking of bringing a friend, there's Oketra's Monument, which says whenever you cast a creature spell, create a 1/1 white warrior creature token with Vigilance. Now, those non-token creatures bring friends that also happen to have Vigilance. But we even have a way to make our lands in our hand useful with Ayula's Influence. It's an enchantment for green, and it says discard a land card, create a 2/2 green bear creature token. So now we can turn our hand of lands into a giant army. But with Null Mage Shepherd, we can put all of our creatures to even more use. She's a 2/4 elf shaman that costs 3 and a green, and she has tap 4 and tap creatures you control, destroy target artifact or enchantment. Again, we're going to have an absurd amount of creatures in play. With this in play, we can tap any 4 of them that we want whenever we want to destroy an artifact or an enchantment. So yeah, it's pretty much going to be impossible for our opponents to keep any valuable artifacts or enchantments in play. And we actually have one other way to make sure that they don't have, well, any. But to talk about that, let's move on to how this deck actually wins. And that card would be the fantastically beautiful Rampage of the Clans. It's an instant for 3 and a green, and it says destroy all artifacts and enchantments for each permanent destroyed this way. Its controller creates a 3/3 green centaur creature token. So our opponents might have an artifact or an enchantment here or there, and they might be pretty valuable to them, but instead of getting that, well, here you go, you get a 3/3 token. Oh, and you know all those artifact creatures that we happen to have in play? Well, now they're 3/3s. And the best part about this card is that we can do this at instant speed before our turn. So this can come out of absolutely nowhere and be game ending. And then Emrakul's Evangel is not as surprising, but it is still incredibly effective in this deck. It's a 3/2 human horror that costs 2 and a green, and it has tap, sacrifice it, and any number of other non-Eldrazi creatures. Put a 3/2 colorless Eldrazi horror creature token onto the battlefield for each creature sacrificed this way. So apart from essentially Universal Automaton and Endless One, we can sacrifice all of our creatures, and now they're 3/2s. And keep in mind that both this and Rampage of the Clans work great with Creeping Renaissance and Fecundity. And they also work fantastically with Gutter Grime. Gutter Grime is an enchantment for 4 and a green. It says whenever a non-token creature you control dies, put a slime counter on Gutter Grime, then put a green ooze creature token onto the battlefield with this creature's power and toughness are each equal to the number of slime counters on Gutter Grime. Basically, when we have a non-token creature die, we make an ooze. And then every single time that happens, all the oozes get bigger. So even just throughout the game, if our opponents block our creatures or we block their creatures, or if we mass sacrifice our creatures, we're getting a ton of value. We essentially turn our tiny creatures into massive threats. And speaking of turning our creatures into massive threats, we're also going to be running Jolrael Monvalia Recluse. Jolrael is a 1/2 human druid for 1 and a green, and she has whenever you draw your second card each turn, create a 2/2 green cat creature token. So first off, yeah, we're going to be making a lot of cats with this. But more importantly, by paying 4 green until end of turn, creatures we control have base power and toughness XX for X the number of cards in your hand. With a few draw engines online with this deck, we can easily get 7+ cards in our hand. So yeah, all of our unassuming tiny creatures in play are now huge. And speaking of making our tiny creatures into big threats, there's Essence of the Wild. Essence of the Wild is a 6/6 avatar for 3 green. It has the very simple text, creatures you control enter the battlefield as a copy of Essence of the Wild. So now any creature that we have that comes into play as this. You know all those creatures that we're going to be casting for free? Well, now we get 6/6s for free. And with any of our token generators, now they're also 6/6 tokens. So yeah, that can end a game, especially if we can give them haste with something like Crashing Drawbridge. But then we've got Ronus' Monument, which helps us out in multiple ways. First off, it says green creature spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. So this can help us save mana on some of our creatures. On top of that, it says whenever you cast a creature spell, target creature you control gets +2/+2 and gains trample until end of turn. So we can make one of our creatures incredibly large in a turn and hit really hard. And if Nylea happens to be a creature, that's pretty much game over for one opponent. Getting to 21 commander damage with a giant trampling Nylea is not that tough. But we also have another monument that can help us out in a different way with Bantu's Monument. It says whenever you cast a creature spell, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. So yeah, we can drain our opponents for a ton and gain a lot of life in the process. And of course, there's Psychosis Crawler, which says whenever you draw a card, each opponent loses 1 life. With this deck, again, we're going to be drawing an absurd amount of cards, so this can drain our opponents out in no time. So I hope that you enjoyed this look into what might be my craziest deck of all time. Again, it's a deck that can do some incredibly powerful and unexpected things. I mean, who knew Mono Green Storm could be a thing? And with that, this show is coming to a close, so it's my turn to hear from you. So in the comments below, let me know what your thoughts on this episode are, and as always, thanks again and have a good one.